Hey, everybody, welcome back to another show about Strat-O-Matic Football. And today we're going to be interviewing Glenn
Guzzo.
Guzzo. We just talked about this.
We've only been
Italian,
really talking about for
every
years.
interview.
I don't know my last name.
Guzzo.
Dennis Crowley. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. So in Italian, it's Guzzo,
Yeah,
right?
would be, but I wasn't born there.
Yeah, very good.
I think we're frozen here.
I think we are. Glenn, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear Anthony, but Dennis is frozen.
Dennis frozen on his side.
Yeah.
Well, we can, if we want to, we can just jump right into the first question and
Sure,
maybe
go
Dennis
ahead.
comes back to us. And if he wants to start over, we can tackle that then. But let's assume we're going forward. So appreciate the time today. We really do. Thank you for carving it out. Can you give us, I guess, let's start sort of big picture, give you a chance, sort of give you the floor. Can you give us a sort of state of the state on where you think Strat Pro Football is as we launch this new season? I'm very much interested in sort of giving you the opportunity to tell us what you think are the game's strong suits and weak points, or perhaps the opportunities for the future, or any pressures or threats you see sort of coming ahead, just sort of a general state of the game.
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there. And the first caveat is I'm not an employee of Strat-O-Matic. I mean, I don't have things like sales figures, but I can say we're talking about strengths. I mean, to me, Strat-O-Matic Football is still the greatest head-to-head experience of any sports board game that rates real players I've ever played. And I've owned probably 200 different games. So, that remains a great strength, and it remains a strength on the computer as well as a board game. I think the play flow of the game is also great, a strength. In my book, Strat-O-Matic Fanatics, the creator of the Madden game, Trip Hawkins, who has a degree in game theory from MIT, talks about strategy games and the ideal choices. He says, if I've got 1,000 choices, you've got 1,000 choices on what to do, then the game becomes very boring because we have no idea what each other's going to do. You're just throwing darts. So he says you want the ideal strategy for accessibility, play value. It's rock, paper, scissors. And, so each player's got 3 choices. Everybody can play. You have pretty quick understanding of strengths and weaknesses. It's good strategy. Well, you think about Strat-O-Matic Football. What do you got? 3 run choices. You got 3 pass choices. The defense has run pass with a wrinkle of perhaps a double team or a key. Obviously, in the advanced game, you got more complications with the movement of players, but even then, it's a limited number of players who can move around. And so Strat-O-Matic Football, like the other Strat-O-Matic games, has what Hal Richman always liked to refer to as play value. And while statistical integrity is essential in any Strat-O-Matic game, whenever it's come to a push or shove of just that extra little bit of statistical validity versus play value, Richmond has always chosen play value in those situations. And Strat-O-Matic Football's just great at it. I would say, quite frankly, another great strength of the game are people like you. I mean, you're constantly pushing for the game to be better. You're very observant. Your suggestions are great, even when they can't be practically applied or promptly applied. I know that when I was publishing the magazine StratFan from 1991 to 1999, we put in a lot of suggestions, playing tips, and made some observations about the game that the game company did end up adopting. Things like the individual fumbles, things like the fact that quarterbacks were responsible for a lot of fumbles and maybe most fumbles. And at the time, the game did not have that. So I could go into more, but want to get the rest of your question. I think in terms of stress points for the game, solitaire has always been an issue. I mean, as great as the game is head to head, if you're not playing basic, then solitaire can be a real challenge in trying to play it on a board game. And I think that's more relevant now than it was when the game was developed. It is, after all, a game that is constantly trying to deal with the challenges of the changes in the NFL, which come fairly often and sometimes very dramatically, with a game that originally was designed in the late 1960s, and when the NFL was quite different. And the target audience then, as was the case with each of the Strat-O-Matic games, was for 12-year-olds. Well, okay, that's fine. 12-year-olds, kids could always find other kids in their neighborhood to play with. But the audience has gotten a little bit older than that, a lot older than that. And we, as adults with jobs and families, and who have been separated from our friends by career moves and other things, don't always have someone nearby to play head-to-head, or when we have the time to play, it's not when other people are awake. So solitaire becomes that much more important. And Strat, is got that issue if you're not playing basic. But as far as the other challenges maybe facing the game, I would say I don't really see a competitor game out there that threatens Strat-O-Matic Football. There are a lot more baseball games out there, a lot more basketball games out there. Football seems to be a very big challenge for someone else to introduce in a game that has that play value as well as statistical integrity. It just doesn't happen very often at all. But there is an issue anyway, and that is with time to play. These days, especially with busy adults, and with attention spans lower for all ages, it takes a while to play a football game. You get 120 plays, it's pretty hard to play a game in an hour or less. It's almost, you have to be playing very rapidly and not keeping stats, basically. If you're going to have 120 plays plus kicks and maybe plus penalties, and you are going to keep some stats, then the game's going to take a while. I play pretty fast, and for me, it's an hour and a quarter or more. And I'm sure for other people, it's an hour and a half or more. I would not be surprised to find people spending 2 hours playing a game head to head.
And that's board game you're talking about.
Yeah, board game. But I guess if you're playing head to head, you still gotta, with the computer game, you're still clicking on formation, clicking on player.
Yeah.
Location
Sure.
of the play. It's not just a press enter and you're done.
Yeah. There's some of us that can play a game in 45 minutes online.
Good.
But an hour is, I would say, typical for my games. And I have some opponents that are really taking their time, and the games will stretch to 90 minutes. So that's kind of similar to what the board game is. I think, Anthony, you have a similar experience, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Average of 75 minutes, probably.
So if you wanted to play an entire NFL season, what do you got? 16. You got 32 teams times 17 games. That's 16 times 17. That's 272 games. Probably take you longer to play that 272 than it would to play 810 baseball games on the computer for a 10-game, a 10-team league. So it's harder to be a power player unless you're really, really devoted. As far as the economic fortunes of the game, well, I don't have the data. I believe it has always been true since day one of the football game until now that the football game has always been Strat-O-Matic's number 2 seller, well behind baseball, but always ahead of basketball and hockey. So I expect that it's profitable, and I expect that it's important so that Strat-O-Matic can actually have a game line and not just be a baseball game.
Very cool.
Appreciate it.
Going along with that, there's been a big increase in like the, these DraftKings kind of contests where you're playing, same day fantasy sports type things. Do you see Strat-O-Matic Football? Is there anything in the works that would, allow us to play during the season online in some kind of new type of game, or can you envision Strat like putting together like Strat-O-Matic week 1 2023 season, go online like they do for 365 and draft your team and get the results based on what the stats are in real time?
Well, I could envision it because baseball has it, Baseball Daily. And I don't know if all of your followers are familiar with Baseball Daily, but it is a day-by-day approach to the current season. You start off with players rated on their most recently completed stats. They're, in some cases, though, with rookies who are on opening day rosters or other guys didn't have ratings, Strat-O-Matic, their projections. So then each day, every day of the season, those ratings are updated. And early in the season, the most reliable information you have is the past data, because the guys only played 1 or 2, 3 games. But with each day, there is a greater weight assigned to the current season's data as it gets blended with the past season. And by the end of the year, you're playing totally with this year's data. So you are managing along with the manager of those teams. Which guy is there something to a guy being hot? He's done well for the last week or for the last month, and maybe I want to choose him in my lineup over some guy who had a better card to start the season. So if Strat-O-Matic did that for baseball, certainly I can envision it for the other sports. But as far as I know, it's not imminent.
Got it. Yeah, Football Weekly. Let's see it. We'll talk this year. Next time, maybe it'll be a reality, or at least on the horizon. So, and I know the next question, I know you've answered some of this on the forum, but for our viewers who aren't on the forum or who may have missed it, let's talk about some specific ratings for players that surprise some folks. So I don't know if you want to go through these one by one, or just let me list them for you and then you can talk about them. What's your preference?
Go ahead and list them. That's fine.
Okay. So Justin Simmons, some people talked about him being carded as a strong safety in the game instead of a free safety, which he shows up on NFL websites like Our Lads and NFL.com, ESPN.com on those depth charts. Similarly, Rodney McLeod, he got a 6 versus the pass as an outside linebacker when most depth charts showed him as a safety. Fletcher Cox, he was carded as a defensive end when, again, most depth charts and his history up till now, he's played defensive tackle. Kyle Juszczyk, going from traditionally being a 6 run blocker, suddenly his run blocking dropped to a 4. And going along with that, I guess someone wanted to know about Chris Myrick on the Giants. He got a 6 run blocker rating. They want to know if that was based on analytics, or in other words, did he earn it? And then the Bengals defense shows up as a 3-4 in the game, whereas most depth charts showed it as a 4-3.
Okay, well, that's a lot. One by one answers. Yeah, I don't think you want one answer for all of it. So Justin Simmons. Okay, first of all, the umbrella thing I want to say about this is it seems like every year, but now more than ever, it has become much bigger challenge for me to sign these positions accurately, reliably, because the NFL moves people around all the time. I mentioned in last year's podcast, I give you a little pop quiz. I said of all the NFL players who started 1 or more games on defense last year, how many of these guys had even a single game where they played it all at one position? And the answer was 0.
Hmm.
I mean, that's amazing, right?
Right.
Free safety is not a free safety all the time. A defensive end is not a defensive end all the time. A middle linebacker is not a middle linebacker all the time. All right. So, I mean, if you really just wanted to go for it, I mean, you rate everybody at 4, 5, 6 positions, which would be utter chaos for the rating system, would make the game almost unplayable. But all right, so with that in mind, and part of what's in mind here is that when you look at depth charts, when you look at games started, when you look at snap counts and snap counts by position, it gets really tough sometimes, more than a few times, for me to sort that in a way that says, okay, well, this guy should be this position, but if we do that, then somebody else is out of position. How do we balance that? These things don't always agree with each other. Depth charts don't always agree with each other, but even where they do, we're now using data that we have purchased. It's proprietary data. It's not a publicly available, that shows where each man lined up to start the game and what percentage of his snaps were taken at each position that he played. And this will differ from something like the NFL Game Book, Game Center, because the Game Center is something that I always liked to use in the past, those game books, but I found that it had too many flaws. For one, it tends to list a player by his roster designation as opposed to where he lined up for that game. So Justin Simmons shows up as a free safety on the roster, and every game he's put in the Game Center, he's a free safety. But in the data we have, the number of starts Justin Simmons had at free safety was 0. And the number of games when he took more than 8% of his snaps at free safety was 0, usually 2 or 3%. Okay, so you still have a choice to make here. You've got Kareem Jackson and Justin Simmons, and further data, which is available on Pro Football Focus, for instance, is that even though Simmons played 12 games and Jackson played 17, Simmons played more snaps in the slot than Jackson did. So with all that, Simmons is a strong safety and Jackson is a free safety. All right, so that's how the decision gets made. Somebody doesn't like that, wants to change it for themselves, go ahead. But, this is not done by whim. This is done by looking at everything we've got to look at and seeing what makes the most sense. In the case of McLeod, he is one of several strong safeties who is listed as a starting linebacker in our game, partly because our team defense card is hard-coded for 3 linebackers. And on teams like McLeod's Indianapolis team, there were a lot of defensive backs who got serious starts and very few linebackers who got serious starts. And specifically, the Colts had 6 defensive backs who had at least 9 starts. They had 2 linebackers who had more than 5 starts. Now, McLeod has a linebacker rating because, according to that proprietary data I referred to, he started 6 games in the linebacker position, including 4 of the last 5. Now, if you want to go ahead and play McLeod at strong safety, we have rated him for that. And this is true of these other guys I'm talking about who will put in at linebacker. But if you do that, then you're starting EJ Speed, right, presumably, who had 5 starts, none after week 5. If you start Speed at linebacker and McLeod at strong safety, then you're bouncing Rodney Thomas, who had 10 starts, including 4 of the last 5, at strong safety when McLeod was listed as an outside linebacker in the data I'm referring to. All right, so again, There's a logic, a reason for all this. But if you want to play McLeod as your starting strong safety, do it. He's rated for it.
On all these points, I mean, how much is related to offenses just going more 3-4 wide to start?
It's related. It is definitely related. It
And
is definitely related. So if offenses are using 3 wide receivers 60% of the time, and defenses are starting 5 defensive backs accordingly, that's definitely going to show. You get 6 defensive backs with 9 or 10 starts or 15 starts on a team, that adds up in excess, especially when your alternative is you've really only got 2 linebackers who started more than a handful of games. There are some teams where their third linebacker started like 2 games. So in that situation, again, that's a limitation of the game, is we have a team defense card that says 3 linebackers start. All right, so you're either going to take a guy like McLeod, who actually in our data did start more games at linebacker than any third candidate on the team, or you say, well, too bad, we just got to start whoever was a bit player, and didn't start late in the season. We're going to make him a starter anyway. So, it's not a great choice, but in this case, I thought it was a pretty easy choice.
what do you think we should, if we're trying to project where some guys are going to be next year, are we looking more towards where they're lining up sort of in the box of whether they're going to be strong safety or coverage responsibilities? And there's so much zone versus man, but in man situations, are they lining up and racking up sort of in PFF coverage responsibility chances, and maybe that's what we should be looking for, that they would go to strong safety because they're taking on more one-on-one situations? What sort of things should we be looking for?
Well, what makes it tough for you is there's no one source. You just can't say, well, if I go to Pro Football Focus, that's it. If I go to Game Center, that's it. If I go to the depth chart on NFL.com, that's it. So you really need to look at all those things, and you're making a best guess at that situation. If you do the reading that we do, that means you're reading a lot of newspapers, beat writers, not just what shows up on NFL.com. You're going to pick up some clues about that. But not many people are going to do that. And for good reason. It takes a lot of time. So, if you're trying to be sure, I cannot give you that assurance.
Okay, so I know you can't tell us anything, but touch your hat if it's true media. I've seen that reference on broadcast a lot. Like they'll show a stat and they'll say from True Media. I try to go to their website. There's nothing that we can buy. So putting 2 and 2 together. So,
well, I'm always looking for the best information I can get, and I asked for this data, from this company that Strat-O-Matic works with, and they said, yeah, we can do that. Cool. So this is the data I've got. Now, I can't independently vet their data, but I don't have any reason to believe that it's invented. All right, so Fletcher Cox, Hargrave and Joseph are the tackles on that team. And in our data, again, Fletcher Cox, who played 16 games, had 16 starts at defensive left end.
Cool.
And he had 13 of those games where the majority of his snaps were at defensive left end. The only other choice is you could say, well, I'm going to be stubborn about it. Cox has always been a tackle. I like him as a tackle. He's a tackle. And then who's going to play end? Well, Hargrave was listed at right defensive end with some regularity. You could do that, but it wouldn't be as true as to the data anywhere close. And, again, I mean, we're not rating these guys on tradition.
Right.
And we're rating them on the data we have for the current season. So that's Cox. Jusic, surprisingly, barely qualified for a 4. He was almost a 0.
Wow.
That's based on the scouting I've referred to in past years, that we also have proprietary information from a professional scouting service. And that scouting service had him as a 0 blocker. Pro Football Focus's rating for his run blocking was barely a 4. But the fact that he was a Pro Bowl player, I just said, okay, he's going to get a 4 at least. All right, but I could not make him a 6 again. Although you'd think if he's in the Pro Bowl and he didn't have tremendous running stats, that he must have been there for his blocking. But I think he was there for his history, because he didn't have as many runs or as many pass catches. There's just so few fullbacks in the NFL.
That's the other thing too. Yeah, there's competition.
Somebody gets the Pro Bowl thing. Okay. Although, if you notice in the All-Pro list now, they don't even have a fullback. All right, so that's Jusic. The Bengals are an interesting case. They really were a hybrid defense. They were listed as a 4-3. We made them a 3-4. Why? Because they had a lot of interior defensive line play. And again, in our data, Hendrickson shows as a starter at outside linebacker 13 times and Hubbard 10 times. So if I wanted to force a 4-3, one of them would be an end, the other would be an outside linebacker, and it would still look funky. What you get instead with both of them at outside linebacker is, if you want to play the 5-2 that the Bengals often played, you move those guys up and you got your 5-2. But it wouldn't be that way if it was, well, it could be that way if it started off as a 4-3. So again, it's deference to the data. But you guys are very good at zeroing in on my toughest choices and the times I spend the most time on sweating over this stuff. And part of the sweat is left or right. Okay, the game book is terrible at that. There's no uniform reporting system in the Game Center game books. So some teams will say left or right. Some teams will just say defensive end. Some teams will just say defensive line. At linebacker positions, you're not only going to see left linebacker, right linebacker, middle linebacker. You're going to see Sam and Will, and you're going to see XLB and JLB, and of course WLB and SLB. It's all over the place. All right, with unique designations that are not ever coded, never explained. Here's what an XLB is. All right. So I'll look at that stuff, but it's the Game Center game book stuff has less and less influence now on me in the terms of where to pick these guys than to look at the snap counts, the data we have, and the starts. Depth charts do matter. But unfortunately, they disagree with each other fairly often. And they'll list a guy who's been on the injured list for most of the season as the main guy at middle linebacker. Well, we can't work with that. Who's next up? Well, sometimes this guy is a guy they show as an outside linebacker. So sometimes, you get everything in alignment. Sometimes the Game Center stuff is really helpful for a team. And too many times, the combination of these things is really just maddening. And teams flop their guys from left to right all the time. Your best pass rushing outside guy is going to pick on the weakest tackle, and wherever that goes, teams disguise their defenses. The cornerbacks, some teams use a cornerback as a shadow, other teams don't. Keep interchangeable safeties. So again, going back to the first point about nobody plays one position for an entire game, you could find a way to justify almost anything, including defensive ends playing in pass coverage. All right. So I'm leaving somebody out, aren't I? No, I guess I got
Chris. No, Chris Myrick. I added that in. That wasn't on the original list.
No, Myrick earns his grade based on the scouting service and the data we have. So
Perfect. Okay, well, we can go on to the next one then.
Well, yeah,
Okay.
moving on to the running cards, and this
Yeah.
Dennis puts out a sort of a question out to the forum, and everyone sort of participates with some questions. I think
Sure. Great.
this one
That's
came
great.
from there. Yeah, last year they were asking about James Conner, and that sort of in this form, you had mentioned he had such a good card versus his yards per carry.
Yeah.
At least in part due to all of his TDs. And in this set,
Right.
we see you see some apparent contradictions. Jamal Williams had 18 touchdowns on his team, but Swift seems to have a better guessed right running card than Williams. So can you give us some insight into that sort of
Yeah, I
running card?
can. And I will say that, well, let me start off. Two big issues that hurt Williams in this case. One is the disparity in yards per carry. Swift 5.5, Williams 4.1. Now, we have data that says how many times this guy run in goal line situations or really short yardage situations so that he maybe gets a bump on guess right because he's running in tough yard situations. Well, in Williams' case, as you might guess, 17 rush touchdowns, that he ran more than most backs in those tough yard situations. But he did not run nearly enough, to my surprise, by the way, he did not run nearly enough to reach the threshold that Hal had set for saying if a guy runs this percentage of the time in those tough yard situations, then he gets that bump.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the second thing that differentiates Conner and Williams are their quarterbacks. Murray wasn't very good this year. And so Conner and the other running backs needed a little bit of bump because teams would guess run more often against Arizona than they would against Kansas City or Cincinnati or Buffalo or teams with really good quarterbacks. Goff had a really good year. And so the balance of pass run for the Lions was about right out of the chute. And also, when we do the team comparisons to see if the team makes sense, the Lions are right where they should have been in terms of their one-loss record. And so there wasn't a lot of call for human intervention here to make the team come out right. That said, and I also, by the way, looking at the difference between Swift's average and Williams' average, I did make one adjustment in Williams' favor by trying to bring them a little closer together. But in retrospect, I didn't do enough. And have to do it all over again, I would do something better for Williams than we did, especially because of the disparity of the carries he had versus Swift. So I second guess myself just as you guys second guess me.
We see, I mean, Austin Eckler didn't have as many touchdowns last year, but you see those +1 sprinkled in, guessed right, line buck 6 and 7, I think it is. I mean, is that the sort of intervention that you'll do? Where you'll
No,
make sure
that
he
is
gets a
not.
yard?
That is not the intervention. The intervention comes before that. It comes in an adjustment for how often we're going to anticipate that this player runs in a guess right situation.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
All right. And so you have a team percentage to start with. And then you say, should this be adjusted for any of the backs? And in a case where you have a dominant passer, you're saying, yeah, it's going to be adjusted for all their backs. that his team is going to be guessed pass so often that if you don't downgrade the runner's cards, they're going to be much too good running wrong. In the case of a team with a very weak passer, just the reverse. So there's an adjustment at that point. But then if you also have a disparity between backs on the same team, there are ways to adjust it. It's a lot trickier, but there are ways to do it.
Similar question for A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones.
Yeah,
their figures.
there again, you've got a similar situation: 5.3 for Jones, 4.1 for Dillon. Did Dillon run at anywhere near that threshold for adjustment for tough yards? No, he wasn't even close to what Williams had. His margin of tough yardage runs over Aaron Jones was not that big a deal. Was some, but it was not notable. It's not something that data would pop out to us and highlight and say, "Oh, take a look at this guy." And there again, you got a very competent passer, Aaron Rodgers. So there wasn't an automatic call to say we got to do something for these running backs.
Cool. Okay, so I think that takes me over to me. So, and I know we talked about this a little bit before we started, that you don't really have an answer for this, but there were some people asking on the forum about improvements to the encyclopedia or the statistics package that comes with the game. Have you heard anything, if that's on the wish list or to-do list for the game developers at Strat at some point?
All I know is Bob Winberry has a very long wish list. And each year he takes, this is for all the games. And each year he takes a look at that list, says how many people are asking for this and what is it going to take to do it? He's got just a finite amount of time. He's very tightly budgeted. He's very disciplined about this. It says, I can get 6 new features into this game this year. But if I do this one, I'll only have time to have 2 new features in this game. All right. So he's got his own juggling act. I don't have the wish list. I haven't had any recent conversations with Bob about, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with about the football encyclopedia.
And the similar question we have is about overusage, if it can be updated up to 17 games and as opposed to a 16-game schedule. Things like a tight end overuse exemption at 40 receptions has knocked a lot of marginal tight ends into just being able to be overused and thrown at. But you mentioned that's just not your side of the
It's not something I work on at all. Yep. I would say that my conversations with Winberry over the years is that's something he's usually sensitive to, but I don't know his state of mind on that now.
Okay. So back over to you, Dennis.
All right. So, we've seen the NFL go from a 16-game schedule to a 17-game schedule. And who knows, they may go to an 18-game schedule at some point. But it was a little bit of a surprise to some of us that Tyron Smith of the Cowboys, the offensive tackle, got carded. Now, he didn't return until mid-December. He was able to get, I think, 4 games played, and yet he got carded. So was that a direct result of the fact that we played a regular season into mid-January with 17 games? And, what's your thought on that? Are we going to see more guys with less than 8 games carded now, or are we still sticking to that 8-game threshold?
There's always been an allowance for some exceptions. And the exception usually, more than usually, almost always is a guy who comes back from his injury, finishes the season, and usually then also is a starter in the playoffs, as Smith was. Steele went down for the year before week 14 or around week 14. So he still had 13 starts. Smith finished up when he came back and also was the starter in the playoffs. So if you're going to play this team in the playoffs, realistically, you need Smith. Now, if Smith had only had 1 start in the playoffs, that makes it a really much tougher call. So I can't tell you there's a minimum number of games, but whatever the minimum has been, Smith is a contender.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking. Because part of the question was, what's the lowest that's ever happened? I think this is, from my recollection, this is it.
So this is not a reflection on the 17-game season at all, except perhaps to the extent that because the NFL played longer into the year, Smith had time to get healthy enough to play as much as he did.
Cool. Yeah. So this is, I think the earliest one I had before this was the 5 games that Bob Sanders played.
Yeah, he's the one.
Cardinals.
He's the one that comes to mind. I'm not. He would be the one I would have guessed if you'd said before this, what's the lowest, but I'm not certain of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, moving on. Some have noted, and I've noted actually, that QB fumbles seem to be a little lower than might have expected this year. I noticed a QB like Trevor Lawrence, he led the league in lost fumbles last season at 9. He was at 5 the last season. And his chances of fumbling overall, we're looking at snap fumbles, individual fumble rating, the team fumble rating, their pass blocking. It seems like his chance of fumbles have actually dropped despite his big increase. And similar example with Justin Herbert. And that's with snaps basically flat year over year in those two cases. Do we see something where there might need to be a correction or a patch, or is this something that's built into the model that explains that apparent discrepancy?
I don't anticipate a patch. The process for the quarterback receiver fumbles is very tricky. It is driven more by the team fumbles than anything else. And if the formula that applies is kind of an if-then thing, and it has zero to do with looking at an individual quarterback's fumble rate, number of fumbles. All right, so it has to do with the team stuff. And in some cases, while it would be desirable to have a higher quarterback receiver fumble rating, if the running back contribution to the fumbles is so dominant, it just takes up all the space. I never like to have that in a team that has significant fumbles, as opposed to the teams that just don't fumble. And, of course, you're going to get a blank on the quarterback receiver. But according to the rule book I have for what do I do with this data, how do I parse it, invariably I'm ending up with a half a dozen teams or more that just can't get it quite right. So as I say, it's tricky. You make one change here to get what you think is right, and it throws something else out of whack. Mm-hmm. So I'm not satisfied with it, but it's better than whatever used to happen before, when there were no fumbles at all by quarterbacks. And I'd like it to be better. It's just not.
Thank you. Next one is, I think, sort of in past episodes, you've spoken about sort of the model when explaining what we see on the cards, and sort of what it spits out seems to sort of drive the bus. If that's true, can you provide us just a little more color about how frequently, on average, the humans, as opposed to the model, change a card? Is it a half dozen players in a set, dozens? What are the most common sorts of changes? Sometimes do you sort of look for a particular theme in the cards that you may have noticed just based on observation of the data, that you try to intervene into the model and bring into a particular set?
Well, there's a significant amount of human judgment. However, there's more driven by the data and driven by the model, as you call it. And the model is a combination of computations, some of them quite extensive. You wouldn't believe how many columns of the old spreadsheets that we used to use are devoted just to determine how many combos a receiver will get, when there's only 4 possibilities in each category. All right. So, but it's a combination of that data, those computations, plus Hal's rules. And the rules tend to set parameters that say, here's the priority. If there's going to be a change by a human, it can only deviate by this range. plus or minus,
Mm.
right? And certain rules are hard and fast. They're absolutely inviolable. All right, so here's one where I have some discretion, and that is receiver combos. We have the computations, and we also have this professional scouting service. And when those two match on what the combo should be for this player's flat pass or short pass or long pass, that's it. I have no discretion. Done. When they disagree, now I get involved. And that's a fair number of times. All right. It's not all the time. I wouldn't say it's even half the time, but it's quite often. Well, some of the stuff is kind of obvious to me. Long passes, for instance. If I then look, I'll just say this: the scouting report tends to reflect talent, and the computations tend to reflect performance. All right, so let's say the scouting report thinks this guy's a pretty good deep receiver, and the computation says, well, I look and I see, why does the computation say that? Well, it's because he didn't catch a pass over 20 yards all season long, 20 yards in a year. Okay, well, I'm not going to give that guy the upgrade that the scouting service says he should get. He's going to get if he's a wide receiver, he's going to get the minimum combos. Right, so that one, it's fairly obvious. And if it's a running back or a tight end, you may get no combos. All right, so on the other hand, if a guy didn't have a lot of receptions and a lot of touchdown catches, but he did have more than the norm deep balls, because you can tell this is a deep receiver. He's the guy the team wants to throw deep to. And in that situation, the computation may not be the better reflection. It may be the scouting service to say, at least, all right, I can't give this guy max combos, but I can make sure that he is probably got as many combos as the next best guy on the team, because this team chooses him when it wants to go extra deep.
Sure.
All right, so that's an example, and there are similar examples at short pass and flat pass where there's some common sense to be applied. And then there's the other factor, which is, okay, sometimes, well, the statistics don't actually lie, they can deceive. So one of the things Hal has always tried to point out, he says, be aware of a team where one of the receivers was heavily double teamed. He's going to need the benefit of the doubt when these numbers are in disagreement, these ratings are in disagreement, because he's going to get double teamed a lot by the opponent. He's going to need more combos in order to get his catches. Conversely, the other wide receiver on that team has been playing in single coverage all the time and is going to get single covered most of the time and is going to get thrown to more often and doesn't need as many combos to get his catches. So does the team have a dominant receiver? Stephon Diggs, Davante Adams. That's a factor. A famous example from years ago was Wes Welker had over 100 catches, and he didn't get the max combos on short pass. People went crazy. But the other guy on the team was Randy Moss. And Randy Moss was getting double teamed every play of the game practically. And it would happen an awful lot in Strat too. And that was Hal's decision, not mine. Before I was doing it. But that was his explanation. And at least there's a logic to it. So that's, there's one example. Now, I've already mentioned certain things about running backs where I can get involved in trying to bring backs closer together so the starter looks more like the starter, so forth. But there's a limit in what I can do. Quarterback passing, I have very little I can do. But there's one number that I can put in to this long spreadsheet that is the quarterback's ability to go deep. And there again, there's a range of numbers I can put in. This is the lowest I can put in. This is the max I can put in, and it is influential. And some of the times, it's clearly this guy is a bomber. Not so much anymore, because most guys aren't bombers, and most guys have very low completion percentages on the really deep throws, plus 20 throws. But sometimes what I'll pick up in the reading is that this team's offensive line was so shaky on pass protection that the concentration for the team's strategy was to get the ball out in a hurry, which meant that in some cases, doesn't happen all that often, but it has happened repeatedly, that you get a quarterback who has an arm for it and the inclination to throw deep, but is not being given those opportunities because he feels like he's going to end up on his butt instead of getting the pass anywhere near the receiver. So when I see that, then I say this guy's long pass rating needs to be knocked down a notch, so that when you're playing in Strat, if you want to be true to the team, you need to recognize that this is a team that didn't think it could and therefore didn't throw downfield as much.
That's really helpful. Especially the wide receiver bit that you mentioned. That's something I just have not heard before. So those, we sort of tend to believe that the computer is sort of putting out so much, but it's great to get insight on how much you actually are able to.
Well, I wouldn't be too much interested in doing the job if it was just if it was just recording the data, you know. So anybody can do that, and it would not be interesting work. The fact now, you know, I put a lot of pressure on myself with that responsibility. The amount of stuff I read, the amount of stuff I watch, you know, and the amount of data I look for afterwards, you know, to try to support what looks like the right decisions.
Well, speaking of that, let's take a little bit of a tangent here. How long do you see yourself doing the ratings? I know that you took a step back from the thrills and chills this year, and Mike Kane and Ed Barrow stepped up, and that was great. But are we going to be able to, you know, have you as our ratings guru for the next, you know, for the foreseeable future?
You mean when I'm 98?
Well, I don't know. Like, I'm just curious, how long can we keep going? Because I'd love it.
Well, you know, look, I'm 72, and for the longest time, I always thought I would never retire. I would just, if I drop dead at my desk, then so be it, you know. But this last fall, I really overdid it. It was baseball ratings time, but baseball ratings time overlaps the NFL season, when I'd be paying, you know, at least a couple of days a week of doing the reading and recording notes and so forth after the games are played, not counting the time I spend actually watching the games. I try to watch as many as I can. Thursday night game, Monday night game, 3 on Sunday if they're available. I'll check some highlights on certain plays and all that. So I so overdid it last fall that I had severe eye strain and I had some sleep issues. And I just told Strat, you know, for me to keep doing anything at all, I need to not do that again. And so that's why I am no longer writing on the newsletters, the product descriptions online, or the thrills and chills, that kind of stuff. We had to cut back something. And Strat's preference and mine was to still do the baseball and football ratings. So how long does it go? I don't know. I don't have a set time that says, here's when I'm out. So everything is forever until that changes.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I think we're getting towards the end of the questions. Speaking of the models that you talked about earlier before, Tyke, Derby guy on the forum, brought up that there are no 4 halfbacks, 4 run blocking halfbacks this year, whereas last year we had like 3 or 4 of them. So is that like intentionally based on the data, or did you guys?
It was this.
There's fewer wide receivers with a max long pass as well. So
well, that's a different question. First
Okay,
question
let's stick with
on the
the
backs.
fours.
On the backs, there were so few guys who were even borderline to get fours, and invariably they had very few run block chances, very few snaps that they took in a run blocking situation. I think in retrospect, still would have been a good idea to give a few guys fours just for the sake of having ratings distinctions instead of everybody just being the same. But it wouldn't have been very many guys, and none of them were a clear call that says this guy deserves a four. So, probably next year, now that you guys have raised my attention on that, I probably will look closer and say, well, can I give the benefit of the doubt to these few guys? The other part was.
Oh yeah, so yeah, he mentioned wide receivers there's not as many with long pass.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure if that's true or not. It seems.
I don't know if it's
I don't
true
really
either.
check that.
I will say that the computations I referred to when you have the computations versus the scouting report, the computations should spit out the same percentage, same quota, if you want to call it that, for maximum. But if there are fewer guys with maximum now, it would probably be that there were fewer guys where the scouting report and the computation were in agreement. I do not know those numbers. Somebody else probably does, but I don't know.
Good deal.
Another question?
So that answers it. I mean, he also mentioned like last year there wasn't a lot of short gains on running backs, and this year there are. But is it really just basically the season data that makes it up? It's not like your guys are going, hey, this year we're doing model A, and next year we're doing a model B, or we're going to have these other.
There aren't different models.
Features.
There aren't different models, and that's not a discretion call. It is a result of the data as modified by the percentage time that each team gets for running right. All right. So each team has a number. They are not all the same. But it's the same for the running backs on their team, unless there's a discrepancy that needs to get resolved, and that's where I get involved in that. I mentioned the Swift and Williams case where I did try to bring them closer together, but it wasn't enough. I was really disappointed a few years ago when there was like almost no short gain rights in one of the card sets. I thought this had to be wrong, and I made sure that the computer wasn't screwed up. I had a systems guy check it. And then this year I did notice, wow, there are a lot of guys with short gain right, which I actually kind of liked. I mean, that's a pretty dynamic situation, especially when you get a guy who's got short gain right on 6 or something like that. That's pretty cool, But I think that's a reflection also of what has happened in the NFL this past year. The number of runs was up, and the percentage of plays that were runs was up, and the average yards per game was up. And so I believe that the model, as you keep calling it, understood that. and so the calculations that spit out allowed for these short gains right. And so that has implications for play calling as well in Strat-O-Matic. Instead of thinking, well, this running can't hurt me too much, I just play it safe and call pass all the time. Now those running backs can hurt you.
Yeah, and we do see that. I think that touched a little bit. You had mentioned that this past weekend you were playing some games was it a Denver tournament or something?
It wasn't a tournament. I was staying with a buddy who's a longtime Strat football player, and he got out his game and we played a couple. So,
Cool.
and in that situation, as probably exists in most strat play, with an awful lot of flat passes being thrown. We were not using the optional rule of flat pass as run because he never has. And we had some pretty good gains by running backs. One of the if you have to fear run more, if you can get hurt by the runs, and the incentive for the offensive team is to call more runs because of the cards and because of the play calling, then I think that suggests the desirability of using the optional rule to call flat passes runs. I know that is just so disconcerting for longtime game players who are used
It's
to it
hard
the
to
other
get
way.
used to it. Yeah.
Just can't get used to it. It just doesn't seem right,
Right.
But if you want more run calls for the defense, that's how you're going to get them. And if you're calling pass 75, 90% of the time, it's going to be pretty hard to spit out the statistics for good passing quarterbacks, for any passing quarterbacks, So,
yeah, I think it's just a matter of how you look at the game. Like a lot of us look at it as that great kind of head-to-head sports simulation version of chess, whereas others want the statistical realism. So, and I think for solo players, trying those rules out to get the statistics right is a great way to.
You're cutting out here, Dennis. If somebody can hear me but not you, let me piggyback on that. Here we go. Okay. Certainly it's a statistical balance thing, but maybe it's a balance thing in the chess game too. I mean, the Strat Football is a great chess game.
Yeah.
It's so much the call and then the execution, the rolling the dice being the execution. And this, I think that one of the things that makes Strat such the great all-time great football game that it is, one of the very best sports simulation games ever, is this sense of how much you put into the chess game and matching wits so that you can appreciate what an NFL coach must go through by the end of the game. A victory is elation, and a defeat is just deflating. But okay, so if you really like the chess game a lot more than the stats, or you don't, at least that's where you want your emphasis. Maybe it's not as much of a chess game if you're calling pass 90% of the time.
Right. It's so flexible that you can get out of it what you want. So I know we've taken up more than an hour, so let's just wrap this up. I have one more question. Nick on the forum wanted to know if you have another book in the works because he loved your Strat-O-Matic Fanatics book.
Well, that's very nice of you. I don't have another Strat-O-Matic book in the works. I've got a couple ideas for books. If I can ever make the time to really do it. I was reading actually on a long flight back from California this past week. I watched what Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code, called a masterclass in writing thrillers. And he said, if you're gonna write books for a living, you have to treat it as work. You have to go to work every day. And he writes 4 hours a day, and it's from 4 a.m. till 8 a.m. And it's like, okay, these are the hours I'm setting aside for writing. He likes a room that doesn't even have internet connections. There won't be any distractions at that hour or through the electronics. And that's his discipline. Well, I do not have those 4 hour blocks of time yet to write another book. But I don't think my next book will be a strat book. You're freezing again, Dennis, at least on my reception. Can you hear me, Dennis? I can't hear or see you right now. Or anyone else. but I can see from the display here that everyone can see and hear you. So to anyone listening, I always enjoy doing this. My answers always end up being too long as I explain the process, and we go longer than the expected 45 minutes or more. It's always worthwhile for me. I hope it is for you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Glenn. I don't know if it's my side or your side, but the internet keeps going in and out. So
Yeah.
I think we're probably going to go ahead and cut it short, cut it off now. But what were you saying? Just in case it wasn't just me that missed it, but what were the book you're thinking about working on? What was it again?
Well, I right now do not have the blocks of time I need to write the books I'd like to write. But the books I'd like to write next are not Strat-O-Matic books.
Gotcha. Okay, fair enough. Well, we'll look forward to it either way. And again, I really thank you for your time. It's always great to get your insight and your opinions and your just to hear about how this great game that. So thank you again for your time. And you have any parting words for us or anything that you're looking forward to if you're going to do any replays of the 2022 season?
Oh, I'm looking forward to this card set a lot. I think the quarterback runs in some cases are very exciting. The running game, back into play again. Every card set is interesting to me. And I really never play enough. I try to play all the Strat-O-Matic sports, and I play baseball most of all. So I'd love to play a lot more football than I do. But anyway, it's always enjoyable to do this. Happy to be helpful.
Very good.
And we'll look forward to do it again.
Yeah, it sounds great. And I agree. I can't wait to play Geno Smith. I can't believe that must-run card. That's going to be fun.
Yeah. And Justin Fields.
Right.
Justin Fields
Sure.
had all those long
Absolutely.
runs.
Yeah, it's gonna be cool. It's gonna be cool. You just need people to call run against Justin Fields. Whenever I face a guy like that, to call pass against Justin Fields. When I see a card like that, I'm gonna call run just to avoid all those must runs.
Yeah, exactly.
Plus 64 on 2 or whatever. So that's how you get more run calls back in the game, folks. So, all right. Well, thanks a lot, Glenn, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, you take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye. Hey, and sorry.